Let's be honest, this day and age 3v3 is the sweatiest bracket. You're going to be fighting gladiators at 1900 or even lower. Playing a bad comp is like getting into a near-fatal car accident and being challenged to a fight by Jake Paul while you're in the hospital. But a cutting-edge comp can only get you so far. What you really need are the proven strategies, which we've packed into hundreds of arena commentaries from some insanely good players available only at skillcap.com. Just select the spec you want to learn, and then find the matchup you struggle with. Our team of pro players will guide you step by step through your hardest counters, while pointing out common mistakes in real time and teaching you secret tricks you wish you learned earlier. SkillCap members also get instant access to hundreds of videos, including class courses, role tips, positioning guides, and a brand new course that teaches you how to counter every class in the game. Best of all, everything we offer is backed up by a rank up guarantee. If you don't gain at least 400 rating while using our service, you'll get a full refund, no questions asked. Anyway, so what makes a comp good in modern WoW? For one, start with the best melee, which right now are Outlaw Rogue and Feral Druid. The best comps start with Immortal Strike Andy, and right now these two specs are so good at enabling everyone else. On EU, Outlaw Rogue is widely regarded as the best spec in the entire game because it does one thing super well. Outlaw Rogues are the best at preventing the enemy team from having fun. Turns out being jam-packed with control while being practically immortal makes for a really good class in PvP, and it's no wonder that Rogues continue to be the best buddies of any metacaster, which right now includes Affliction Warlocks, Balanced Druids, Frost Mages, and Elemental Shamans. Simply having Cheap Shot means having enough lockdown to let your overpowered wizard cast just enough to land a one-shot. This is why Echo looked so dominant in the recent AWC. All Chanimal needs is a rogue to press stun, allowing him to one-tap with Haunt. While Feral Druid isn't exactly flavor of the month anymore, it's still insanely good, playing an almost identical role. Just pair up with any metacaster, press your stuns, and then let them win the game for you. It's a pretty easy formula to follow. The so-called god comp of this season was Feral Shadow Priest Holy Paladin, which of course had its showing in the grand finals of the North American AWC. This is one of those comps that is just designed to not die. With infinite cooldown trades coming from the Paladin paired with the utility of a Shadow Priest, this year's god comp wins strictly by attrition. Now that we know what the best comps look like, let's look at some other high tiers. If Outlaw Rogue is a fully grown adult, Windwalker Monk is kinda like a teenager. Sure, it's a Mortal Strike melee who can do some things on its own, but it's not mature enough to fully carry. You have good damage and decent defensives, but you really don't have great lockdown, which means you're forced to play with other specs that can support your setups. Your comp selection is going to be fairly similar to other meta melee. Pick up an Elemental Shaman or Balanced Druid, or just take a car ride out with Dad and play with an Outlaw, which will help you lock down targets for your big one-shots. Now, if Outlaw is an adult and Windwalker Monk is a teenager, Warriors are babies. You definitely need to play with classes that can support you. Since your biggest pain point is mobility, you'll want some help with lockdown and a blessing of freedom to stay on target. Thunder Cleave is a natural choice, but even Kitty Cleave should work too. Although we haven't seen it too much on the ladder, we would also guess that Outlaw Rogues would make great partners too. Our final Mortal Strike Andy on the A tier is Assassination Rogue. Ever since the nerf to Kidney Shot, which now has a 30-second cooldown up from 20, Assa Rogue has felt a little bit clunky. It's definitely not bad, but you really need to maximize the amount of damage you can do in very short bursts, which naturally means playing with an Affliction Warlock or Frost Mage. These specs also provide you with enough CC to stall momentum, allowing you to reach your next setup. Now that we're done with every Mortal Strike carry, let's take a look at their supporting role of casters, starting with Boomkin. The mini rework to Incarnation was a huge benefit to Balanced Druid in recent weeks, helping propel it to the AWC Grand Finals in a meta that wasn't looking too Boomkin friendly. It's no accident that Boomy Outlaw Rogue was the winning formula, as the lockdown from a rogue makes those Incarnation one-shots insanely deadly. Anyway, one of the best healers to pair with a Boomkin is Preservation Evoker, since they have some of the best HPS in the game and fit well with any comp that simply wants to press W and run the enemy team over. Moving on, if you thought we had forgotten about Affliction Warlock, trust us, we haven't. As you already know by now, Affliction has one of the deadliest one-taps in the game, which makes them the kill target in almost every matchup. Seriously, it's like they have a bounty over their head the moment they step into arena. Anyway, avoiding this problem is simple. Just play with an Outlaw Rogue or a Feral Druid, and let them cross CC for you so you can send some poor soul back to Brill with a single Haunt. The same basic principle applies to Frost Mage. For the 100th season in a row, RMP is one of the best comps in the game, but FMP is definitely up there too. These comps are insanely durable thanks to their enormous amount of control, and right now with damage being so high, you're going to want a comp that is good at being evasive. While Wizard Cleaves can work, they can also get run over quite fast these days, which is why it's nice to slow the game down a bit with a setup-based melee. And speaking of slowing the game down, Elemental Shaman will also make its return to the high tiers. By now, you're probably shocked at just how many comps are playable for Ellie. We've said this before, but Elemental Shaman is the vanilla ice cream of casters. As long as there is an MS effect on the team, you're bound to have a decent comp as Ellie. If you're wondering what comp is best here, it's the two that have our S tier melee. The better the MS Andy, the better the comp. Next up is Shadow Priest, who has been consistently solid this entire expansion. As we mentioned earlier, Shadow Priest was a key component of this season's God comp, and every single season you can count on some Shadow Priest Holy Pally comp to be quite strong. These two specs have some of the best defensive synergy in the game. Of course, Feral Druids and Outlaw Rogues are going to be your best DPS partners, but don't sleep on Demo Warlock. As the only other caster with healing reduction and micro CC, you're going to have a lot of control with this Shadow Play variant. Our last wizard to make the A tier is Devastation Evoker. Sticking on theme here, Dev will naturally do well with its classic Double Dragon comp, pairing up with a Feral Druid or Outlaw Rogue and a Preservation Evoker, but a Fistweaver Monk can work too. The appeal of Double Dragon is that you give the enemy team a bunch of cast bars to deal with. If the Dev Evoker gets kicked, the Pres Evoker can cast, and vice versa. It's basically a caster cleave in disguise. By now, you might be surprised that we haven't mentioned BM Hunter. While the spec definitely tears it up in solo shuffle, it is noticeably weaker in 3v3 since it simply gets owned by a lot of meta comps, especially Rogue Lock. This is why you really didn't see it played much in the recent AWC, since there are just better and more consistent options for high-level play. Anyway, your best option is still good old Jungle Cleave, but if you want to try something different, we have seen a tank comp do well on EU. Now it's time to go down to the mid-tiers, starting with our remaining Mortal Strike Andes. At this point, Sub-Rogue is just an off-brand, budget-friendly version of Outlaw. While it still has its infamous burst, it's just far less consistent compared to Outlaw, since the Pirate spec essentially gives its team steroids while being completely immune to death. The same comps are going to work for every Rogue spec. You can't go wrong with Rogue Mage or RLP. Again, your goal is just to enable your OP Wizard, allowing them to cast with your lockdown, setting up kills in the classic 3-2-1 fashion. Next up is Demon Hunter, which hasn't quite seen too much play so far this season, despite getting a few buffs. While DH is far from bad, it just is lacking the consistent damage to work in the meta, while also being fairly prone to getting shut down on its microbursts. To supplement these problems, you can play with an Elemental Shaman, who will help you keep targets locked down, or a Balanced Druid, which will help you win with control during big burst windows. Alternatively, MVQ has had some recent success with Double Paladin, which helps solve any uptime issues thanks to all of those blessing of freedoms. Next up on this tier are both remaining Hunter specs. Look, we know Mark's just got some nice little buffs, but it still feels significantly worse than BM. Right now, it's just a bit too unforgiving to play in Arena. With the popularity of Outlaw Rogues and Feral Druids, it's really easy to get shut down on your burst. You will spend all game stunned, disarmed, or even dead. Because of this, your best bet is making a deal with the devil by playing Thug Cleave with a sub-rogue or some good old-fashioned jungle. Our last Mortal Strike spec on the mid-tiers will be Demonology Warlock. While having an MS effect is definitely high value in the current meta, one of the biggest setbacks of Demo is that it doesn't really synergize well with Feral Druids or Outlaw Rogues. Instead, Demo essentially steals their role and its ability to help carry other high-tier casters. Games are bound to be long as any of these wizard cleaves, but you are going to offer your team enough stability to slow the game down. Now let's move on to our first non-MS melee, starting with Ret Paladin. Despite the fact that Ret Paladin does great in solo shuffle, it falls off a bit in 3v3 since many of the high tier comps can simply outpace and outcontrol most Ret Pally comps. The classics will still work in this day and age, so aim to pair with a warrior or BM hunter if you want to grind rating. Enhanced performs a similar function to Elemental. It essentially plays a support role for any high tier melee, helping control the pace of the game while offering a ton of utility in order to be disruptive. While this spec is traditionally seen as a bit niche, it has seen play in the North American AWC and is still capable of achieving the highest ratings. Up next is Destruction Warlock, and here we have another spec with Little Brother Syndrome. These days, Affliction and Destro basically perform the same role, with one being noticeably better. Because of this, Destro can play the exact same comps as its older brother. An Outlaw Rogue or Feral Druid is going to give you the lockdown you need to win the game, not only with damage, but also CC. Rounding out the mid-tiers are the other two mage specs. Unfortunately, Fire and Arcane are still strictly worse than Frost in every way possible. Fire still feels like a damage sponge in Arena, and Arcane is still limited by its rampy, cast-heavy playstyle. With that said, your best comps should be no surprise. Just pair up with a Feral Druid or an Outlaw Rogue to climb the ladder. Unfortunately, it's that time where we need to go down to the low tiers. Up first is Frost DK. Don't get us wrong, we love Frost, especially when Frost God Zeke gets to showcase it in the AWC. As you know by now, Frost DK has the most linear win condition in the game. You absolutely need to play with another spec that has a dirty 1 minute go. Naturally, Preservation Evokers will be your go-to healer, since they can support your setups with Deep Breath. Then look to fill in that second DPS slot with a Devastation Evoker, Windwalker Monk, or even a Fury Warrior. Despite recent buffs, Unholy DK is still the worst DPS in the entire game, with Frost and even at one point Blood being better options. As we've mentioned, Unholy had taken some big enough hits in the early expansion that it hasn't quite recovered. The core problem of the spec is that it seems entirely balanced around Mythic Plus. Against teams who stand on the same pixel all game, Unholy is totally fine, but the moment players spread out, its damage really suffers. Now, before we move on to the healer meta, we have a wildcard alert. Augmentation Evoker hasn't seen much play this season, which makes it super hard to rank. With that said, it previously had one of the scariest burst setups in the game before recent nerfs. Devastation is still way more consistent, but Aug could work with the Feral Druid. Now let's take a look at the healer meta as it stands in Season 1. It shouldn't come as any surprise that Disc Priest, Holy Paladin, Preservation Evokers, and Mistweaver Monks all come out on top. They've all been mentioned several times throughout this video because right now you need strong throughput and mitigation in order to handle the meta. We think Resto Druid might be a bit better in 3v3 compared to Solo Shuffle, simply because it can consistently play RMD, which helps offset some healing difficulties thanks to its endless control. On the flip side, Holy Priest and Resto Shaman are a bit worse in actual 3v3. Despite Holy getting some recent healing buffs, it's still strictly worse than Discipline and can struggle hard in comps that aren't hyper-aggressive or super durable. The main problem with Resto Shaman right now is that the meta is a bit unfavorable for their classic comp selection. With Demon Hunter being underwhelming and Unholy DK falling off a cliff, you're left picking up the scraps where you can. Remember, the best 3v3 strategies can be only found at skillcap.com. Just select whatever spec you are currently playing and then find the matchup you struggle with. Our team of pro players will guide you step by step through your hardest counters, teaching you secret tricks you wish you learned earlier. Skillcap members also get instant access to hundreds of videos including class courses, role tips, positioning guides, and a brand new course that teaches you how to counter every class in the game. Best of all, everything we offer is backed up by a rank up guarantee. If you don't gain at least 400 rating while using our service, you'll get a full refund, no questions asked. That's going to be it for now. Thank you all for watching. See you soon.